Okay, we're going to be looking at classification, overview, um, kingdoms, invertebrates, and vertebrates in this video. So the first scientist that started to organize different animals and skeletons that he found was Carolus Linnaeus, and this is a really old aspect of life science. So once people were traveling around to different areas and they were starting to collect um, uh, skeletons and preserving different species from different areas, they started to look and see that there was a lot of variety in different areas, but also there were similarities in those different animals that they found. So you could go to Africa and find a really large cat, like a tiger or a lion, and then you could compare that to house cats or things that were around in Europe and look at their similarities in bone structure. So scientists start to say that some of those things fit together, and they started to try and group them by how they went together. So basic organization is domains, kingdoms, phylums, class, order, genus, species. And that's domain is like the largest largest box that you put things in. And as you move towards the species, you're getting more and more specific. We're just going to focus on kingdom, phylum, and class over the next couple of weeks and use it as a way to look back into kind of what we've learned through genetics and evolution and look at some of the different variety of animals that we see. So if you look on the right, you can see just what that would look like for specific animals. So if we are within the animal kingdom and you looked at the phylum, there's vertebrates, and then there's invertebrates like annelids and mollusks. And then there's class, which is getting then more specific. So there's some types of vertebrates like fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. So you're going to be doing part of this off the video notes, part of it using the book. So first thing you'll do is take the image on the right and copy it down and give yourself give yourself space at the top of the page to put all those things in. So there's 6 kingdoms, starting with archaebacteria. So those were the oldest type of bacteria that live in really extreme environments. Um, they're prokaryotic and unicellular. So those would be the first cellular living things that ever existed. Um, then you have things that other bacteria that are getting more complex. They're called eubacteria. They live in regular normal environments. So as the earth started to become a little bit more hospitable, you get this different type of bacteria coming up. These bacteria are the kind that you would find if you, um, in your stomach, you'd have these type of bacteria. If you get a sore throat, strep throat can be caused by this type of bacteria. Um, and then these prokaryotic cells that didn't have a nucleus, didn't have organelles, they evolved into protists. So kind of the same way that you saw that transition of Tiktaalik, the transitional fish, into an amphibian and a reptile, you would see that same transition from eubacteria to protists. So protists are eukaryotic cells. So they're cells like your cells in your body or in the plants around the room. They have nucleus, they have cell organelles, and the idea, again, if you think back to when we learned about cells, the idea was that these larger prokaryotic cells engulfed smaller prokaryotic cells and became eukaryotic cells. Um, so protists are really funky kind of a group. They're single-celled. Some are multi-celled, um, and they have this really large variety of ways that they live. Some of them are plant-like, some of them are animal-like, and some of them are fungus-like. And then the thought is that the same way you had the transition from bacteria to protist, you got a transition from protist to plants, animals, and fungi. So there's a protist that could do photosynthesis that was single cellular. It started to group up, and the cells started to function and work together. Um, and that became the first plant. And then you got same thing with animals. You had cells working together to get energy from their environment by engulfing things or eating things. that became the first animal, and then same thing for fungi, cells grouping together to become one living thing. So what you're going to do after you've copied that picture on the right, pause the video, go to page 525 to 528 in your textbook, and add 2 to 3 characteristics about each kingdom. We're not going to spend a lot of time on kingdoms. We're just going to focus on the animal kingdom and just focus on vertebrates. In 7th grade, you focused on each of the different kingdoms. So, but I do want you to know just a little bit about it. So if I talk about protists, you'll go, okay, yeah, those are the eukaryotic things that are single and multicellular, that have nucleus, just a couple characteristics of each one. So go ahead and write that down. Underneath, if you look at right underneath, I kind of gave you an outline format. So after your picture, use a note format like what I've done. So I did I did Roman numeral 2, 6 kingdoms of living things, and then I indented A period, and I started with archaebacteria. You already have whether it's unicellular or multicellular, prokaryotic or eukaryotic in the picture. So if you can just add the 2 to 3 characteristics underneath archaebacteria, and then so archaebacteria, then you'll do eubacteria, protists, fungi, animals, and plants. So go ahead and do that. You can pause the video and then come back in a little bit to finish it off. Okay, welcome back. So like I said before, we're going to focus just on animals, and in 7th grade you focused on invertebrates. So I just want to quickly go over that. We're not going to go over each phylum of invertebrates. You won't have to know that for a quiz or a test. But I want you to know that protists evolved into invertebrates. And those were the first types of animals. So before we get to vertebrates, we're going to talk about invertebrates. So they're the first group of simple animals. Some examples include sponges, jellyfish, tapeworms, roundworms, earthworms, squid, insects, and starfish. So I've given you specific examples of each type of invertebrate class or phyla that exists. And if you would just know, a couple examples, I might ask you what are some examples of invertebrates. What makes them an invertebrate is the fact that they don't have a backbone. And just like when we talked about in the evolution video, we talked about how there are some things retained, like the tail development was retained from fish through amphibians, reptiles, and even through to mammals, and we lose it as we're an early developing cell. We've got important developmental traits that were developed in invertebrates and then passed on because they were successful. So the next 2 slides are going to be devoted to those things. So one thing that we got from our invertebrate ancestors is tissues. So the first type of invertebrate was a sponge. It was just a group of cells working together. And then we got things like jellyfish. Jellyfish were the first invertebrates to have tissues. So this is cells starting to be similar in the appearance and in their function. And they work together to perform some function. So you could have nerve tissue that's good at sending signals. You could have skin tissue that's good at protecting the outside of the organism. You could have cells that are light cells that are good at detecting light and dark. So tissue is the first thing. The next thing we get is it's called the germ layers in development. And that just means that as you're like a ball of 8 cells, you start to have those cells specialize. So the cells on the outside become the ectoderm, and that's your skin, hair, those type of tissues. You've got a mesoderm. Those are the kind of middle internal cells. Those become things like muscles and bone. And then you've got the endoderm, and that's the inside cells that start to develop things like the digestive tract and different organs on the inside of the body. And in between, for the more complex invertebrates, you get a thing called a column, and that's an open space, and it allowed the muscles to grow independent of the body wall. So this compartmentalization just allowed those early forming cells to specialize right away and start to develop more complex organs and tissues. Um, and it just allowed for more complex structures. So that's the body development from early cells. Next thing that you get also was it's called cephalization. So this is the evolutionary trend where nerve tissues concentrating at one end. So you start to see not only specialization within the body of the organism, but at different ends. So you've got one end that maybe starts just as a few cells that can sense light and dark, and the organism kind of builds up more and more cells, and the more cells it has for detecting light, the better it survives. Then it gets more nerve cells for passing signals on, can sense, uh, it has kind of a sense of touch. All those things start to develop, and then you get a head region that can process those signals. So that's called cephalization. Um, then another type of development is, along with the cephalization, is early organisms such as a sponge. So the very first invertebrate to develop was asymmetrical. Then the jellyfish has radial symmetry. That means it can be divided in many different ways. Think of a circle in geometry, and you can divide it in half a bunch of different times. Um, and then as it started to get cephalization, it developed bilateral symmetry, which means it can only be divided in half in one way. Um, and that's things like human beings. You could split a human being just, you know, if you divided them, you have an invisible line from the top of their head down to their toes, and you could divide their body in half that way. Um, the last thing that we got from our invertebrate cousins was the early cell development. Um, in the video, when we talked about hair forming, it was because there was an infolding of the skin that allowed for things like hair follicles to develop or teeth to develop. So we know that that's a really important part of cell development, is the ability to fold in on itself and form compartments. Um, the same thing happens when you're just a few cells big. Um, so for very simple invertebrates, or very simple animals, it's called protostome development, and that translates into first mouth. So that first infolding of cells becomes the mouth opening of that organism. So things like a mollusk, like a squid, or an earthworm, or any insect, that first infolding becomes the mouth of the animal. Um, the very last, the most complex invertebrate is a starfish, and it has the same kind of infolding happen when it's just a few cells big, but that infolding actually becomes the butt of the organism. And everything after starfish, so bony fish, mammals, birds, reptiles, human beings, are that first infolding becomes the butt of that animal. And that's called deuterostome development, which means second mouth. And that's the last of what you're going to do off the video. You're going to switch back over to the textbook. So go back into the email, and you're going to have a set of pages that you're going to copy off of for vertebrates, the different classes of vertebrates, and also the characteristics of those vertebrates that developed. Whew, done and done.